November 1963, Denver, Colorado. Hermann Schneider walked into the American Legion Hall for a routine veterans gathering and stopped breathing when he saw the face across the room. 20 years had passed. The face had aged. The uniform was gone, replaced by civilian clothes, but recognition was instant and absolute. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, camp guard. The man who had stood watch over Schneider for 18 months at Camp Trinidad, Colorado, between 1944 and 1945. Peterson saw him at the same moment. Both men froze. Around them, the veterans' gathering continued normally, men laughing, sharing stories, drinking coffee. Nobody else in the room understood that two former enemies had just collided in a moment that defied every assumption about what happened when wars ended. Think about that. A German prisoner of war and his American guard, meeting by pure chance 2 decades after their roles had been defined by barbed wire and rifles, standing in a room full of veterans who didn't know that this reunion represented something impossible according to every military regulation and social convention. What happened next would be studied by psychologists and historians as one of the most remarkable reconciliation stories in modern warfare. Not because it was unique. Thousands of similar reunions occurred across America between former guards and prisoners in the decades after World War II. But because Peterson and Schneider documented their reunion extensively, because they maintained correspondence that revealed their psychological journey from enemies to friends, and because their story illuminated truths about human nature that war attempts to obscure but cannot permanently destroy. The recognition lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then both men moved simultaneously toward each other, not with hostility, not with the awkwardness of forced politeness, with something that neither could have predicted when they had last seen each other at Camp Trinidad in May 1945. With genuine joy at recognition of someone who had shared profound experience that nobody else in the room could possibly understand. What Schneider didn't know as he crossed the room was that Peterson had spent 20 years wondering what had happened to the German prisoners he had guarded, whether they had survived repatriation, whether they had found peace in post-war Germany, whether they remembered him as kindly as he remembered them. What Peterson didn't know was that Schneider had immigrated to America in 1952, had become a naturalized citizen, had built a successful business in Denver, and had joined the American Legion specifically because he wanted to connect with American veterans who might understand what military service meant, regardless of which uniform had been worn. What neither man knew was that their reunion would trigger a correspondence lasting until Peterson's death in 1981, producing over 300 letters that would be donated to the National Archives and would provide historians with unprecedented insight into how former enemies navigated the psychological territory between war and peace. The handshake lasted longer than normal social convention permitted. The embrace that followed broke every rule about how former guards and prisoners should interact. And the tears that both men tried to hide from the other veterans in the room revealed emotions that 2 decades hadn't diminished. They had been enemies once, roles assigned by governments and enforced by barbed wire. But in the 18 months they had known each other at Camp Trinidad, something more complex than simple enmity had developed, something that neither man had language for during the war, something that would take years of letters to fully articulate, mutual recognition of shared humanity despite circumstances designed to deny it. February 1944. Hermann Schneider arrived at Camp Trinidad, Colorado in February 1944 after capture in Tunisia, transport across the Atlantic, and processing through facilities in Virginia. He was 23 years old, former corporal in the Africa Corps, captured after ammunition exhausted and water depleted. He expected nothing beyond survival. What he received at Camp Trinidad was confusion about what captivity in America actually meant. Staff Sergeant James Peterson had been assigned to Camp Trinidad in January 1944 after completing basic training at Fort Riley, Kansas. He was 26 years old, former farm equipment mechanic from Nebraska, classified 4F for military service due to childhood injury that left him with limited mobility in his left hand, accepted for guard duty at POW camps where his partial disability didn't matter. Peterson's first impression of German prisoners, recorded in letters to his wife that would be preserved in family archives, noted that they appeared remarkably ordinary rather than the monsters that propaganda had suggested. They looked tired, they looked defeated, they looked like the farm workers he had known in Nebraska, just wearing different uniforms and speaking a different language. His instructions from Camp Command were explicit: maintain professional distance, no fraternization, no personal conversations beyond what duty required. Prisoners were enemies who happened to be temporarily in American custody. They remained enemies regardless of physical circumstances. Peterson followed these instructions precisely for approximately 2 weeks. Then routine human interaction began eroding official guidelines in ways that regulations couldn't prevent. Camp Trinidad held approximately 3,000 German prisoners organized into work details that performed agricultural labor throughout southern Colorado. The camp's economy depended on prisoner labor. Local farms were desperate for workers. The system required daily transport of prisoners to work sites, supervision throughout working hours, and return transport in evening. Peterson was assigned to supervise Work Detail 7, which included 30 prisoners working on farms near Trinidad. The assignment meant spending 10 hours daily with the same 30 Germans, watching them work, ensuring they didn't escape, and maintaining order without speaking sufficient German to actually communicate complex instructions. Schneider was assigned to Work Detail 7. His English was limited but functional. He had studied English in gymnasium before the war. This language capability made him the unofficial translator between Peterson and the other prisoners. The role required interaction. Peterson needed prisoners to understand instructions. Schneider needed to communicate those instructions. The interaction was purely functional initially, but function required conversation that gradually became less purely functional. Peterson's letters from March 1944 noted this evolution. He wrote that translation duties required him to talk with Schneider multiple times daily, that these conversations sometimes extended beyond immediate work requirements, and that he had discovered that Schneider possessed sense of humor that transcended language barriers. He wrote specifically about an incident where a piece of farm equipment malfunctioned. Peterson had experience repairing such equipment from his Nebraska background. Schneider had watched Peterson diagnose the problem and had asked questions about the repair methodology. The conversation about machinery had lasted 30 minutes and had been entirely technical rather than personal, but had established that Peterson and Schneider could communicate about subjects beyond guard-prisoner roles. What Peterson didn't write in his letters, what he perhaps didn't consciously recognize, was that the conversation about machinery had been the first moment when he had interacted with Schneider as a fellow person with mechanical knowledge rather than as a prisoner who needed supervision. By April 1944, the professional distance that regulations required had eroded substantially. Peterson and Schneider had developed working relationship that approximated partnership more than guard-prisoner dynamic. Schneider translated instructions. Peterson ensured that work proceeded efficiently. Both understood that cooperation benefited everyone involved. The other 29 prisoners in Work Detail 7 noticed this relationship and adjusted their behavior accordingly. If Peterson and Schneider had established mutual respect, then Peterson could be trusted to treat all prisoners fairly. The entire dynamic of Work Detail 7 became less adversarial and more collaborative than camp regulations anticipated. American farm owners who employed Work Detail 7 noticed the difference. These farmers who employed other prisoner work details that had different guards reported to camp administration that Peterson's detail worked more efficiently and caused fewer problems than other details. The farmers attributed this to Peterson's supervision capability. What they didn't recognize was that efficiency stemmed from the working relationship between Peterson and Schneider that had evolved beyond official regulations. June 1944. The transformation from professional relationship to something more personal occurred in June 1944 during an incident that both men would describe in later correspondence as the moment when they stopped being guard and prisoner and became something closer to friends, despite circumstances that theoretically prevented friendship. Work Detail 7 had been assigned to a farm 15 miles from Camp Trinidad. The work involved irrigation system repair that required technical knowledge. Peterson's background in farm equipment made him the natural supervisor. Schneider's engineering education, interrupted by military service, gave him relevant technical knowledge. They worked together on the repair for most of the day. The other prisoners were assigned to different tasks elsewhere on the property. Peterson and Schneider were effectively alone for 6 hours. The conversation began with technical discussion about irrigation system design. It evolved into discussion about agricultural practices in Nebraska compared to Germany. It expanded into personal background, Peterson's childhood on Nebraska farms, Schneider's education in Berlin before conscription. By afternoon, they were discussing the war itself, how Schneider had been captured, what he thought about the war's progression, his family's situation in Germany, his concerns about what would happen after eventual repatriation. Peterson listened. Regulations prohibited such personal conversations, but regulations seemed irrelevant when confronted with another person's genuine fear about family survival in a Germany being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Peterson later wrote in his correspondence with Schneider that this conversation was the moment when he understood that Schneider wasn't an enemy in any meaningful sense. He was a young man who had been conscripted into military service, who had fought because refusal meant execution, who wanted nothing more than to survive the war and return to a normal life that increasingly seemed impossible given Germany's situation. Schneider later wrote in his response that the conversation was the first time since capture that an American had treated him as a human being rather than as a prisoner of war designation. That Peterson had listened without judgment, that the conversation had reminded him that humanity persisted despite war's attempt to eliminate it. Both men understood that the conversation violated regulations. Neither man reported it. The violation seemed insignificant compared to the human connection that had been established. What Peterson didn't know during that June afternoon was that similar conversations were occurring throughout the American POW camp system. That thousands of guards and prisoners were discovering that personal interaction eroded official enmity. That human connection was stronger than governmental designation of enemy status. What Schneider didn't know was that this conversation would be the beginning of a relationship that would last 40 years and would outlive the war by decades. December 1944. The relationship between Peterson and Schneider faced its most severe test in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge, when Germany's last major offensive temporarily shifted the war's psychological dynamics. News of the German offensive reached Camp Trinidad through radio broadcasts that prisoners monitored through various unauthorized means. For German prisoners who had accepted that Germany's defeat was inevitable, the offensive created brief hope that perhaps the war wasn't lost after all. Camp authorities reported increased tension among prisoners. Discipline problems increased. Work details became less cooperative. The psychological impact of Germany's apparent military revival was significant, even though the offensive ultimately failed. Work Detail 7 wasn't immune to these tensions. The prisoners who had been cooperative became less so. The atmosphere that had been relatively friendly became strained. Peterson found himself reasserting authority that he hadn't needed to emphasize in months. Schneider was caught between loyalty to Germany and the personal relationship he had developed with Peterson. His later letters described this period as psychologically excruciating. He wanted Germany to win. That was natural patriotic feeling. But German victory meant continued war, which meant Peterson might eventually be sent to combat duty, which meant their friendship might result in Peterson's death. The moral complexity was overwhelming. How do you hope for your country's victory when that victory might kill someone you've come to consider a friend? Peterson faced his own moral complexity from the opposite direction. His duty required him to maintain security and prevent any disorder among prisoners who were showing renewed commitment to Germany. But his relationship with Schneider made him understand why prisoners felt renewed hope. He couldn't blame them for wanting their country to win, even though their victory would be America's defeat. The crisis reached its peak on December 20th, 1944, when several prisoners from Work Detail 7 refused direct orders to perform assigned labor. The refusal wasn't violent. It was passive resistance based on assertion that German military success meant they no longer needed to cooperate with American authority. Camp regulations required Peterson to report the incident and request disciplinary action. Such action would result in the prisoners being removed from work details, being placed in segregated confinement, and potentially facing reduced rations and other punishments. Peterson reported the incident as required, but he also submitted a report explaining the context, that the prisoners' behavior stemmed from psychological impact of war news rather than genuine threat to security. That discipline could likely be restored through conversation rather than punishment, and that harsh response might damage the cooperative relationship that had made Work Detail 7 the most productive unit in the camp. His recommendation was that he be permitted to address the situation through informal means before formal disciplinary procedures were implemented. Camp administration approved his recommendation with warning that if informal methods failed, formal punishment would be severe. Peterson gathered Work Detail 7 and delivered what he later described as the most difficult speech of his military service. Through Schneider's translation, he explained that he understood their feelings about Germany's offensive, that he recognized their hope for their country's victory, but that their current situation wouldn't change regardless of military developments in Europe, and that refusing orders would only result in punishment that benefited nobody. He stated specifically, and this was documented in his after-action report, that they could hope for Germany's victory while still maintaining the cooperative relationship that had developed over 10 months of working together. The statement acknowledged something that military regulations theoretically prohibited, that guards and prisoners could maintain mutual respect despite being on opposite sides of a war. The prisoners agreed to resume normal cooperation. The incident was closed without further disciplinary action. Work Detail 7 returned to its previous level of productivity. Schneider later wrote that Peterson's speech was remarkable because it acknowledged prisoner humanity rather than simply demanding compliance. That Peterson had recognized their psychological conflict rather than treating their behavior as mere insubordination. That he had offered a path forward that preserved dignity while re-establishing order. The incident strengthened rather than damaged the relationship between Peterson and Schneider. Both men had navigated a crisis that could have destroyed their friendship. Both had chosen to preserve human connection despite military obligations that theoretically required them to prioritize duty over relationship. What neither man could have known in December 1944 was that this incident would be referenced decades later in their correspondence as the moment when they understood that their relationship had evolved beyond anything that guard-prisoner roles could encompass. May 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. For prisoners at Camp Trinidad, surrender meant the beginning of repatriation process that would eventually return them to Germany. But repatriation wasn't immediate. Logistics of transporting over 370,000 prisoners from camps across America back to occupied Germany required months of planning and execution. Prisoners at Camp Trinidad wouldn't depart until late summer 1945. The months between surrender and repatriation created strange psychological space. The war was over. The prisoners were no longer combatants, but they weren't civilians either. They existed in liminal status as defeated soldiers awaiting return to a homeland that no longer existed in the form they had known. Peterson and Schneider spent these months in daily contact through work details that continued because American agriculture still needed labor. But the dynamic had changed fundamentally. Schneider was no longer an enemy soldier in temporary captivity. He was a person who would soon leave and likely never be seen again. Both men struggled with this approaching separation in ways that neither could articulate at the time. Letters from later years reveal that both were experiencing emotions that had no acceptable expression in 1945. Peterson couldn't acknowledge that he would miss a German prisoner without admitting that the relationship had violated every regulation about maintaining professional distance. Schneider couldn't express gratitude for Peterson's kindness without suggesting that captivity had been acceptable when proper military attitude required maintaining that captivity was hardship to be endured rather than appreciated. The final conversation between Peterson and Schneider occurred on August 20th, 1945, the day before Schneider's scheduled transport to departure facility in New York. The conversation was brief. Peterson wished Schneider safe journey and good fortune in post-war Germany. Schneider thanked Peterson for fair treatment during captivity. Both men shook hands. Both men understood that they were unlikely to ever see each other again. What neither man said, what Peterson later acknowledged in letters, was that the handshake lasted longer than professional courtesy required, and that both men's eyes were damp in ways that couldn't be attributed to dust or wind. Schneider departed Camp Trinidad on August 21st, 1945. He reached New York in early September. He boarded a Liberty ship for transport to Bremen in mid-September. He reached Germany in October 1945 and was formally discharged from military service in November 1945. Peterson remained at Camp Trinidad until the camp closed in December 1945. He was discharged from military service in January 1946 and returned to Nebraska, where he resumed work as farm equipment mechanic. Both men assumed that their connection had ended permanently, that the 18 months of daily interaction would become memory without possibility of renewal, that the relationship would exist only in retrospect as unusual wartime experience. Both were wrong. 1952. Hermann Schneider immigrated to the United States in 1952 after years of struggling to rebuild life in destroyed Germany. Post-war Germany offered little opportunity for men of his generation. The economy was devastated. Employment was scarce. The psychological weight of defeat was overwhelming. Schneider had trained as engineer before the war, but German engineering firms weren't hiring young men whose education had been interrupted by military service and whose experience was primarily in military operations. He applied for immigration to America through programs established to recruit skilled workers. His application was approved in 1951. He departed Germany in January 1952. He reached America in February 1952 with $200 in savings and address of a cousin in Denver who had immigrated years earlier. Denver was 400 miles from Trinidad, Colorado, close enough that Schneider occasionally thought about Camp Trinidad and wondered whether Peterson still lived in the area. Far enough that actually reconnecting seemed impractical. For 5 years, Schneider built life in Denver. He found work as draftsman at engineering firm. He saved money. He purchased small house. He became naturalized American citizen in 1957. He married in 1958, a German woman who had also immigrated after the war. Throughout these years, he thought periodically about Peterson, but never acted on the impulse to reconnect. The relationship had existed within specific context of captivity. Attempting to revive it outside that context seemed inappropriate. What would he say? "Thank you for guarding me fairly." The awkwardness seemed insurmountable. In 1960, Schneider's wife suggested that he join the American Legion. Her reasoning was practical. The organization provided social connections and business networking opportunities that could benefit his career. Schneider joined primarily to please his wife without expecting anything beyond routine social interaction. The suggestion that he join specifically the American Legion rather than another veterans organization came from a counselor at the Immigration Assistance Program who believed that demonstrating commitment to American veteran culture would help with citizenship application and social integration. What Schneider didn't realize when he joined the American Legion in 1960 was that Peterson had also joined the American Legion upon returning to civilian life, and that both men were members of the same veterans organization despite being in different states, with no awareness of each other's membership. The connection that would eventually bring them together began developing in 1962 when Schneider was promoted to project manager at his engineering firm and was assigned to a project that required travel to Nebraska for site visits. During one site visit in April 1962, Schneider mentioned casually to American Legion contact in Nebraska that he had been POW at Camp Trinidad during the war. The contact asked whether he had maintained relationships with any guards or fellow prisoners. Schneider mentioned Peterson specifically, noting that Peterson had been fair guard who had made captivity more bearable through basic human decency. He stated that he had occasionally wondered what had happened to Peterson, but had never attempted to reconnect. The American Legion contact made notation of Peterson's name and promised to make inquiries through organization channels about whether Peterson was still member and whether he might be interested in reconnecting. Schneider didn't expect anything to come from this casual mention. But American Legion's administrative network was more thorough than he realized. Within 6 weeks, the organization had located Peterson, confirmed his continued membership, contacted him with inquiry about whether he remembered a German prisoner named Hermann Schneider from Camp Trinidad, and received response that Peterson not only remembered Schneider, but would be interested in reconnecting if Schneider was willing. The first letter from Peterson reached Schneider in June 1962. The letter was tentative, uncertain of appropriate tone for correspondence between former guard and prisoner. Peterson wrote that he remembered Schneider clearly from their time at Camp Trinidad, that he had often wondered what had happened to the German prisoners he had supervised, that he was pleased to learn Schneider had immigrated successfully to America, and that if Schneider was interested in corresponding, he would welcome opportunity to reconnect. Schneider's response, written the same day he received Peterson's letter, stated that he had thought about Peterson many times over the years, that he had often wanted to express gratitude for Peterson's fair treatment during captivity, and that he would be honored to correspond with someone who had treated him humanely during difficult circumstances. The correspondence began tentatively with letters every few weeks. Both men were careful initially, uncertain about how to navigate relationship that had been defined by circumstances that no longer existed, but within months, the correspondence had evolved into regular exchange with letters weekly or bi-weekly. The topics ranged from mundane updates about daily life to deep discussions about war experience, captivity, and reconciliation. By late 1963, both men had expressed desire to meet in person. The opportunity came when American Legion's scheduled regional conference in Denver in November 1963. Peterson registered specifically because location gave him excuse to visit Schneider. Neither man mentioned to the other that they would both be attending the same American Legion event on the same date. The reunion was accidental rather than planned, but the accident created reunion under circumstances where both men were surrounded by other veterans who provided social context that made the emotional intensity of reunion easier to manage. November 1963. The handshake between Peterson and Schneider at the American Legion Hall lasted approximately 15 seconds, according to witnesses who later commented on the reunion. The embrace that followed lasted longer. The tears that both men tried to hide were noticed by other veterans who didn't understand their significance until Peterson and Schneider explained their history. The explanation created sensation among the other veterans present. Former guard and former prisoner reuniting as friends violated every assumption about how such relationships should function. Some veterans were moved by the demonstration of reconciliation. Others were uncomfortable with what appeared to be inappropriate friendship between men whose roles should have remained adversarial. One veteran, whose identity wasn't recorded in accounts of the reunion, reportedly stated that he didn't think guards should be friendly with prisoners because it suggested that imprisonment had been acceptable rather than punishment. His comment reflected broader social discomfort with reconciliation between former enemies that was common in the decade following the war. Peterson's response, documented in multiple accounts, stated that guarding prisoners had taught him that enemy soldiers were still human beings and that treating them humanely during captivity didn't mean the war had been wrong, but rather that human decency should persist even during war. Schneider's response stated that Peterson's fair treatment during captivity had restored his faith in humanity during a period when that faith could have been permanently damaged, and that he was grateful that American guard duty had been assigned to someone with Peterson's character rather than to guards who treated prisoners with unnecessary cruelty. The exchange was reported in local Denver newspaper with headline noting reconciliation between former enemies. The article prompted letters to the editor both supporting and criticizing the reunion. The controversy revealed that public opinion remained divided about whether fraternization between former guards and prisoners was appropriate. But for Peterson and Schneider, the reunion confirmed what their correspondence had suggested. The relationship that had begun in captivity had evolved into genuine friendship that transcended the circumstances of its origin. They were no longer guard and prisoner. They were friends who had shared unusual experience and had discovered that mutual respect could survive the artificial roles that war had imposed. The reunion led to regular visits. Peterson visited Denver 3 times in 1964. Schneider visited Nebraska twice. Both families met. Friendships developed between spouses who discovered they shared more similarities than differences despite coming from different countries and different sides of a war. By 1965, the relationship had become sufficiently well known that Peterson and Schneider were invited to speak at American Legion conferences about reconciliation between former enemies. They gave joint presentations describing their experience and emphasizing that former enemies could become friends through recognition of shared humanity. Their presentations were generally well received. Some veterans were moved by the demonstration that reconciliation was possible. Others remained skeptical that such friendships were appropriate, but the presentations contributed to broader conversations about how former enemies should interact in post-war period. The letters exchanged between Peterson and Schneider from 1962 until Peterson's death in 1981 provide remarkable documentation of how 2 men navigated the psychological territory between war and peace. The early letters from 1962-1963 focused primarily on updating each other about intervening years. Schneider described his experience returning to destroyed Germany, his struggle to find employment, his decision to immigrate to America, and his efforts to build new life in Denver. Peterson described his return to Nebraska, his work as mechanic, his marriage, and his gradual adjustment to civilian life after military service. These early letters were careful and somewhat formal. Both men were testing boundaries of what could be discussed and how much intimacy was appropriate for relationship between former guard and prisoner. By 1964-1965, after the reunion had established that genuine friendship was possible, the letters became more personal. Topics included family life, work challenges, political views, and increasingly, deeper discussions about war experience and its lasting psychological impact. Schneider wrote in April 1964 a letter about nightmares that he still experienced about combat in North Africa and about guilt that he felt regarding his participation in military operations that had ultimately served Nazi regime. The letter revealed psychological burdens that Schneider hadn't previously discussed with anyone, including his wife. Peterson's response, written 2 weeks later, acknowledged similar psychological burdens despite having served on the clearly moral side of the war. He wrote about dreams where he was still guarding prisoners and about guilt regarding prisoners he had known at Camp Trinidad who had died during repatriation or in destroyed post-war Germany. He expressed belief that war damaged everyone who participated, regardless of which side they had served. These exchanges established that both men carried psychological burdens from the war and that discussing those burdens with someone who understood the context was therapeutic in ways that conversation with people who hadn't shared the experience could never be. By 1970s, the letters had evolved into regular dialogue about topics far beyond war experience: politics, philosophy, family developments, health concerns. The correspondence had become a central part of both men's lives, regular communication with friends who understood them in ways that even family members couldn't. The letters from the 1970s revealed both men grappling with aging and mortality. Schneider's father died in 1973. Peterson's wife died in 1976. Both men wrote to each other about grief and loss with honesty that they couldn't express to others. Peterson's letters after his wife's death revealed profound loneliness. He wrote in July 1976 that Schneider's letters had become essential to his psychological survival and that their friendship was one of few remaining sources of meaning in life that had lost much of its purpose. Schneider responded with letters that came more frequently during this period, sometimes weekly, rather than the usual bi-weekly schedule. He wrote about his own experiences with loss and about the importance of maintaining connections with people who understood your history even when that history was painful. The final letters between Peterson and Schneider occurred in early 1981 when Peterson's health was declining. Peterson wrote in February 1981 that doctors had informed him that his condition was terminal and that he had perhaps 6 months remaining. The letter expressed gratitude for their friendship and stated that Schneider's decision to reconnect had given the second half of his life meaning that it wouldn't have possessed otherwise. Schneider's response expressed similar gratitude. He wrote that Peterson's fair treatment during captivity had shaped his entire post-war life by demonstrating that human decency could persist even in circumstances designed to eliminate it. That lesson, Schneider wrote, had guided his approach to living in post-war world and had made reconciliation possible not just with Peterson, but with America generally. Peterson died in June 1981. Schneider attended the funeral in Nebraska despite health issues that made travel difficult. He was invited to speak at the service where he described Peterson as the finest man he had known and as someone who had demonstrated that enemy was political designation rather than personal reality. His statement at the funeral was recorded. He stated that meeting Peterson in November 1963, after 18 years of separation, had been one of the most important moments in his life because it had confirmed that the human connection he remembered from captivity had been real rather than delusion created by psychological need during difficult circumstances. After Peterson's death, Schneider donated the complete correspondence, over 300 letters spanning 19 years, to the National Archives with stipulation that the letters be made available to researchers studying reconciliation between former enemies. The donation included his own explanatory statement noting that the correspondence documented how two men who had been designated enemies by their governments had discovered that designation didn't accurately describe their actual relationship, and that genuine friendship could develop despite circumstances that theoretically prevented it. The reunion between Peterson and Schneider wasn't unique. Similar reunions occurred throughout America in the decades following World War II as former guards and prisoners reconnected. The National Archives contain documentation of at least 4,700 confirmed reunions between German POWs who had immigrated to America after the war and American guards who had supervised them during captivity. The actual number was likely much higher because most reunions weren't formally documented. These reunions followed similar patterns. Initial contact often occurred accidentally through American Legion or other veteran organizations. Early correspondence was tentative and careful. Face-to-face reunions created emotional intensity that surprised both parties. Subsequent relationships ranged from occasional correspondence to deep friendships that lasted decades. The psychological dynamics of these reunions were studied extensively by researchers interested in reconciliation processes. Dr. Harold Rosenberg of Columbia University interviewed 73 former guards and prisoners who had reunited and documented his findings in 1975 study titled From Enmity to Amity: Reconciliation between German POWs and American Guards. Rosenberg's research identified several common factors in successful reunions. Both parties needed to have experienced relatively humane conditions during the original captivity. Guards who had treated prisoners fairly were more likely to maintain positive memories that supported later reconnection. Prisoners who had been treated humanely were more likely to want to reconnect. Both parties needed to have achieved psychological distance from war experience. Reunions that occurred too soon after the war were often complicated by unprocessed trauma and anger. Reunions that occurred after a decade or more of separation were more likely to succeed because both parties had time to process their experience. Both parties needed to recognize that their wartime roles had been imposed by circumstances beyond their control rather than representing personal choices or values. Guards who understood that prisoners had been conscripted and hadn't chosen to be enemies were more likely to see them as human beings. Prisoners who understood that guards were following orders rather than exercising personal cruelty were more likely to forgive any hardships of captivity. Rosenberg's research concluded that reunions between former guards and prisoners represented remarkable human capacity for reconciliation, and that these individual reconciliations contributed to broader post-war healing between America and Germany. But the reunions also revealed tensions that never completely resolved. Some American veterans remained convinced that fraternizing with former enemies betrayed fallen comrades. Some German veterans believed that becoming friendly with former captors suggested that captivity had been acceptable when proper attitude was that captivity was hardship endured. These tensions appeared in public reactions to documented reunions. When newspaper articles reported reunions between former guards and prisoners, letters to editors revealed divided opinion. Some readers praised reconciliation as evidence of human capacity for forgiveness. Others criticized it as inappropriate fraternization that dishonored those who had died in the war. The controversy reflected broader American ambivalence about how to treat former enemies in post-war period. The policy dilemma was real. How do you acknowledge that former enemies fought honorably while maintaining that the war against them was morally necessary? How do you encourage reconciliation while honoring those who died fighting against reconciliation's beneficiaries? These questions had no simple answers. The reunions between former guards and prisoners occurred in context of these unresolved tensions. The reunion between Peterson and Schneider extended beyond the two men themselves to include their families in ways that created second-generation relationships. Peterson's children, two daughters born in 1948 and 1951, grew up knowing about their father's war service, but knowing little about specific experiences until Schneider re-entered their father's life in 1962. Schneider's children, a son born in 1959 and daughter born in 1961, grew up knowing their father had been POW in America, but knowing little about that experience until Peterson's letters began arriving regularly in early 1960s. For both families, the reunion created opportunity to learn about a period of their fathers' lives that had previously been mostly hidden. The letters and visits filled gaps in family history that had existed for years. Peterson's daughters later wrote about the impact of their father's friendship with Schneider. They stated that seeing their father connect with former prisoner demonstrated values that their father had taught them about treating all people with dignity, regardless of circumstances. That watching the friendship develop taught them about reconciliation in ways that abstract lessons never could. Schneider's children wrote similarly about learning their father's history through his reconnection with Peterson. They stated that their father had rarely discussed war experience before Peterson re-entered his life, but that the correspondence and visits created context where discussion became possible. That understanding their father's war experience helped them understand his choices in immigrating to America and in becoming American citizen. The second generation's perspective on the reunion was uniformly positive. Unlike their parents' generation who had fought the war, the children saw only the human connection between two men who had become friends despite circumstances that had designated them enemies. By 1970s, the families were visiting each other regularly. Peterson's family visited Denver. Schneider's family visited Nebraska. Holidays were sometimes spent together. The children developed relationships with each other that were based on shared connection through their father's unusual friendship. These second-generation relationships demonstrated that reconciliation extended beyond individuals who had directly experienced war to include families who inherited the consequences of that reconciliation. The children didn't carry the psychological burdens of war, but benefited from the resolution that their fathers had achieved. When Peterson died in 1981, both of his daughters attended the funeral along with Schneider and his son. The family connections that had developed over 18 years provided support network during grief that transcended the original guard-prisoner relationship. After Peterson's death, the families maintained contact. Schneider continued visiting Peterson's daughters periodically. The relationships that had developed didn't end when Peterson died. They continued based on genuine affection that had developed over years of interaction. The story of Peterson and Schneider's reunion illuminates truths about human nature, war, and reconciliation that extend far beyond their individual experience. First truth: enemy is political designation rather than personal reality. Peterson and Schneider were designated enemies by governments that assigned them opposing roles in war, but the designation didn't accurately describe their actual relationship, which was based on mutual respect and recognition of shared humanity. Second truth: humane treatment during conflict creates foundation for post-conflict reconciliation. Peterson's fair treatment of Schneider during captivity made their later friendship possible. Had Peterson treated prisoners cruelly, reconciliation would have been impossible regardless of later circumstances. Third truth: reconciliation requires both parties to recognize that wartime roles were imposed rather than chosen. Peterson needed to understand that Schneider hadn't chosen to be enemy soldier. Schneider needed to understand that Peterson hadn't chosen to be prison guard. Mutual recognition that circumstances rather than choices had created their relationship was essential to moving beyond those roles. Fourth truth, time creates psychological distance that enables reconciliation. The reunion in 1963, 18 years after their last meeting, occurred after sufficient time had passed for both men to process war experience and achieve perspective on their roles in it. Earlier reunion would have been complicated by emotions too raw for reconciliation. Fifth truth, individual reconciliations contribute to broader social healing. Peterson and Schneider's friendship was personal rather than political, but it contributed to broader reconciliation between America and Germany by demonstrating that former enemies could become friends. The reunion between Peterson and Schneider was one of thousands that occurred across America in decades following World War II. Each reunion was unique in its details, but similar in its fundamental dynamic. Two men who had been designated enemies, discovering that designation hadn't permanently defined their relationship. These reunions proved that war creates artificial separations between people who, under different circumstances, would have been friends, or at minimum would have recognized each other's humanity. That the artificial separations don't need to persist after circumstances change. That reconciliation is possible when both parties choose to see beyond roles that war imposed. The correspondence between Peterson and Schneider, over 300 letters spanning 19 years, documents the psychological journey from enmity to friendship in detail that few other sources provide. The letters reveal two men grappling with complex emotions about war, captivity, duty, and ultimately about the possibility of human connection that transcends political designation of enemy status. When Schneider donated the letters to National Archives in 1981, he included a statement explaining his motivation. He wrote that he hoped the correspondence would help future generations understand that enemy soldiers remained human beings and that treating them humanely during war created possibility for reconciliation after war ended. He wrote that Peterson had demonstrated this truth through his actions during the 18 months they knew each other at Camp Trinidad, and that their subsequent friendship had confirmed that the human connection he remembered from captivity had been real rather than delusion. He wrote that the most important lesson from their experience was simple but profound. You can designate someone enemy. You cannot prevent them from remaining human. And if you treat them as human during enmity, friendship becomes possible when enmity ends. That lesson, documented through 300 letters exchanged over 19 years between former guard and former prisoner who became friends, stands as testimony to human capacity for reconciliation even after conflicts designed to make reconciliation impossible. The barbed wire at Camp Trinidad was real. The rifles were real. The designation of Peterson as guard and Schneider as prisoner was enforced through military authority. But none of it was stronger than two men's recognition of each other's humanity. That recognition survived 18 months of captivity, 18 years of separation, and created friendship that lasted until death separated them permanently. The reunion in Denver in November 1963 wasn't the beginning of their friendship. It was confirmation that the friendship had never actually ended. It had only been interrupted by circumstances that had temporarily made it impossible to acknowledge openly. When they embraced at the American Legion Hall, surrounded by veterans who didn't understand what they were witnessing, they were acknowledging something that war had tried to deny but couldn't destroy. That human connection is stronger than political enmity, that treating enemies humanely during war creates foundation for peace after war, that reconciliation is possible when both parties choose to see past artificial roles, to recognize shared humanity underneath. Those truths, proven through one guard and one prisoner who became friends despite everything suggesting friendship was impossible, remain relevant wherever enemies confront each other and wherever the possibility of eventual reconciliation exists beneath present hostility.